Hi, I'm Maria, and welcome to the first episode of Weirded Out, a true crime and mystery podcast. On this podcast, we'll be deep diving a few true crime cases, and also we'll talk about some mystery stories and some other subjects that are interesting. If you have any suggestions for the podcast, any case that you want me to cover, please let me know. And today we'll be talking about the Keddie cabin murders that is still unsolved case to this day, and we'll deep dive into the attacks that caused Sue Sharp, John Sharp, and Dana Wingate to have lost their lives. So thank you for watching, and without further ado, let's get into it. So today's story takes place in Keddie, a small town in California. As of 2020, it was reported that Keddie had a population of around 68 people. In Keddie was a location called the Keddie Resort. This used to be some sort of getaway holiday place for families to go to. It was like a way to get connected with nature and spend some time with families in a small location, because Keddie was surrounded by woods and hiking trails, so it was a really peaceful place to be. Even though it was a nice holiday location, the Keddie Resort was really run down and it was in decline for the past years. In 1970, they were forced to reduce their prices, and after some time, it became sort of a place for residents to live. So they started renting their cabins in the Keddie Resort for families that were looking for a cheaper place to stay. Just like many other families, in 1980, Sue Sharp and her 5 children moved to the Keddie Resort and they rented Cabin 28. To them, this was supposed to be a dream location and a place for them to start fresh. But unfortunately, that was far from what was going to happen in Keddie. So who were the Sharp family? So Sue Sharp was a 36-year-old woman. She was from Connecticut. She was married to a man named James Sharp. They had 5 kids together: John, who was 15, Rick, who was 10, Greg, who was 5, Sheila, who was 14, and Tina, who were 12. Sue was said to be a very shy woman and very reserved. James was reported to be a very abusive husband, and he was only getting worse throughout the years. A few sources say that at this time James had kicked out Sue and the kids from the house, and a few sources mention that she actually chose to move out of the house with the kids, so it's not 100% confirmed. Correct me if I'm wrong and if it was confirmed, but what we know at this moment is that in 1980, Sue divorces James and moves out of the house with her 5 kids. So with that, they start moving around a little bit and they decide to go to Quincy in California, because that's where Sue's brother used to live, Don. In Quincy, Don rented a trailer with his wife, but they had just recently left. So Sue and the kids went and started living in Don's old trailer. And they stayed in Quincy for around 5 months until they could save up a little bit of money and figure out what to do next. It is reported by a few sources that Tina, the younger girl who was 12 years old, was actually R-worded by one of the neighbors in the area in Quincy. And for that reason, the family decides to pack their bags and move out of Quincy. That's when the family drives around 9 kilometers away from Quincy to Keddie and moved to Cabin 28 at the Keddie Resort. And like I said at the start, to them it seemed like a perfect place to start over. They never thought that this place would be where something horrible would happen. Cabin 28 had only 3 bedrooms, so it was quite small for a family of 6, but it was perfect for them, especially living in a trailer before, so they were getting used to it. So they divided the rooms in a way that Sue, Sheila, and Tina were sharing the master bedroom. Rick and Greg were sharing the other bedroom, and then John, the older one, was in the basement bedroom by himself. This is because maybe he was older and he wanted a little bit more privacy, but his bedroom was not directly connected to the house, so they would often leave the doors of the cabin unlocked so that John could just move in and out freely. Even though the family was adjusting really well to the small town and the kids were making friends, they were still struggling financially quite a bit. Sue wasn't getting any child support from James, but she was getting a $250 welfare from the government and also a few food stamps. And of course, that's not enough to support a family with 5 kids. So she had to take in a few part-time jobs here and there. So she was really busy and sometimes quite absent. But the kids were left alone, sometimes with neighbors, quite often. But still, even though she was absent, she wasn't a neglectful mother. She would provide for her kids really well, and they were really well taken care of. And even though Sue was known to be a reserved woman, she still made time for her love life. And throughout her time in Keddie, she had 3 relationships. They weren't really serious relationships, but she was enjoying herself. She was living her life, working hard, taking care of her kids, and she still had time to have fun as well. Their life in Keddie seemed pretty normal. Nothing crazy. The kids weren't troublemakers or anything. There was nothing that they were worried about. But that was about to change because unfortunately on the night of the 11th of 1981, a really, really gruesome murder was about to take place in cabin 28. That night, it was like a normal Saturday for the family. Sue was at home with the kids, Rick and Greg, and they had one of their neighbors over, Justin, who was a little boy that would play with the kids very often. So him being there for a play date was quite a normal occurrence. And he was actually living in cabin 26, and they were really close neighbors, so nothing strange, just a normal Saturday night. Sheila and Tina were actually hanging out with their other neighbors from cabin 27. They were spending some time there, but later that evening, Tina had to come back home, but Sheila ended up just staying there and sleeping over at the neighbor's house. So you can see that they seem to be really friendly and really close with their neighbors, having play dates and sleepovers. John, the oldest, was really close friends with a boy named Dana Wingate, who also lived in Keddie, and they used to hang out in Quincy because they had friends there. They went to school in Quincy, so they would go to parties quite often, like on the weekends and stuff. So it was quite normal for them to go out on a Saturday night and then come back home later. So that evening after the party, they hitchhiked back home and stayed at home for the rest of the evening. So that night we have Sheila at the neighbor's house, a cabin 27, Tina, Sue, Rick, and Greg at home alongside with the neighbor Justin, and then John and Dana were also at home that evening. On the next morning, on the April 12th, Sheila returns home to spend the Sunday with her family after her sleepover, so she's expecting to see everyone there, probably her mom cooking breakfast, the kids watching TV or something like that. But unfortunately, when she opens the door, what she sees is a scene of a nightmare. She discovers a gruesome crime scene, and she sees her mom, Sue, her brother John, and his friend Dana brutally murdered in the living room. Sheila was, of course, horrified, so she runs back to her neighbor's house at cabin 27, screaming for help. The neighbors phone the police, and then they return to cabin 28 with Sheila to help her. They start knocking on the windows and looking for the boys because Rick and Greg weren't in the living room where Sue, Dana, and John were. So they surprisingly find the boys in the room unharmed in any way, and at first they said that they didn't hear anything, that they were sleeping throughout the night, but that will change later on. At this moment, they are saying just slept, didn't hear anything, didn't know that there was a murder going on, completely unaware, but they were safe and sound, and to them that's what mattered at the moment. The neighbors decided to take the kids out through the window so that they wouldn't have to see the crime scene. And after some time, the officers from Plumas County Sheriff arrived to the crime scene and start reviewing what happened. And right at the start, the investigators make quite a few mistakes, which is very frustrating. So you will see that throughout this whole case, there are a lot of mistakes being made, and it's quite frustrating. The first thing that they do is that they don't secure the crime scene at all. So that allows for a lot of officers to just walk in to the crime scene and step everywhere, touch everything. And that can, of course, contaminate the crime scene. Not very helpful at all. And it's just normal standard to just secure it and be careful where you walk on the crime scene like this. The officers who were there first in the scene said that it was the worst crime scene that they had ever seen. It was extremely gruesome. The amount of blood, it was unbelievable. It was all over the place. Sue, John, and Dana were all laying on the floor, and the house literally looked like a nightmare. So let's go through a little bit of how Sue, John, and Dana were and what the crime scene kind of looked like. They were all bound by medical and electrical tape, and they had either been viciously stabbed, strangled, or bludgeoned. The deputy at the time, Hank Clement, was the first one to arrive at the scene, and he reported that the blood was everywhere. So on the walls, the furniture, the ceiling, the doors, and also on the back steps. The amount of blood and how it was spread suggested to them that the victims probably had been moved throughout the attack around the house, and they were probably alive for quite a while and being tortured or something. So it wasn't a quick murder, it was a complete vicious attack. There was also blood on the sole of Sue's feet, which suggested that she was probably alive throughout the entire attack when she was walking around on blood, and probably she was not the first victim. So Doug Thomas, the sheriff at the time of the murders, said that whoever did this, and that there was probably more than one person, had to have blood all over them. I imagine that if the house looked that bad and the victims also had blood all over them, the person who done this completely must have blood all over their clothes, probably on their face and their hands. So it's quite hard for them to walk around without being noticed after this, but we'll get back to this later on. So a little bit more information on the victims. John was the one that was closest to the front door. He was faced up, his hands were covered in blood, and they were bound with medical tape, and his throat had been cut. Dana was on the floor beside him on his stomach, and his head was badly damaged, as if he was hit with something like a blunt object or something like that, and he was laying partially on a pillow. It was also clear to the officers that he had been manually strangled, and his ankles were tied with electrical tape, and they were also tied together with John, so their ankles were connected. Sue was covered partially with a blanket from the waist up. However, her injuries were still quite visible. She was naked from the waist down. And for a lot of people, it's quite weird that Sue was the only one that was covered. From psychological terms, it can mean that maybe the killer didn't want to look at her while killing her or after killing her. So does that mean that he was only feeling guilty about killing her specifically? So we don't know for sure, but that's something to think about. Like I said, she was naked from the waist down, and she was also tightly gagged with a bandana and her own underwear, and she was secured with medical tape as well. She had a few injuries that consistent with a struggle, so that makes sense because, like we said before, she had blood on the sole of her feet, so she was probably alive and trying to defend herself or the kids, so she definitely had some struggle. And she also had an imprint of an 880 pellet gun on her head. And just like her son John, her throat had also been cut. The autopsy that was conducted later on showed that Sue and John died from knife wounds and blunt force trauma, and that Dana died from asphyxiation. All of the victims had suffered blunt force trauma by 2 hammers, and one of them was in the crime scene, but the other one was missing. They also sustained multiple stab wounds. So going over the murder weapons found, there was a bent knife that was also revealed later on that the reason for it being bent was due to the force of the knife going into something. So that, not only that, everything else, but this specifically shows that this was a very, very aggressive, passionate attack. There was also a butcher knife and a claw hammer that were found in the kitchen, and the rifle was never found. So whoever done this seemed to have taken the murder weapons from the house. So maybe the knives were already in the house, and maybe the hammer. Nobody really knew at that stage, but the fact that they just left the murder weapons there was also quite strange. So it feels like this was quite rushed and it wasn't thought through a lot. So it wasn't something from that's like a mastermind criminal would do. It's like very passionate. It was like a split-second decision probably, and done very aggressively. The police also had 11 blood samples and nearly a dozen fingerprints lifted off of various objects around the house. And the amount of evidence, like I said, the murder weapons and all the fingerprints, all the blood left behind, it just shows that this was not the act of a professional killer. Again, this was rushed and it seemed very personal. It would also take the police hours to realize that there was a 4th victim that was missing. So like we said, Sue, Dana and John were in the living room. They had been murdered. Rick, Greg and Justin were in the room and they were safe and sound, but where was Tina? So she was nowhere to be found. She was missing, and the longer the wait, the higher the chance that the police would be searching for a body. So because of this, they called the Department of Justice to try and help out and start looking for Tina. So during the investigation, they noticed that there was no indication of any forced entry in the cabin, but that makes total sense because, like we said at the start, they often left the doors unlocked for John to go in and out. So they also found an unidentified fingerprint on the railing leading to the front door of the cabin, and the telephone inside the cabin was off its hook and the cable had been disconnected, meaning that nobody could have called anyone even if they wanted to or even if they could. Also, the blinds were shut and the lights were off, but that doesn't really mean anything. It could be that Sue closed the blind and shut the lights when she was getting ready for bed before the attacks happened. It is getting more and more clear to the officers that this person or those people who done this killed with a lot of passion, and it was a lot of personal. They really think that whoever did this was someone that knew the family, but they weren't able to discern an apparent motive straight away. It was alleged that there was a lot of potential evidence that was collected at the time, but that was not really handled correctly. But again, we have, unfortunately, the fact that it was 1980, so it was pre-DNA testing, so very little helpful information was found at the time. So even with a lot of fingerprints and blood samples, they couldn't really do a DNA test. But even with that, they did have a lot of other evidence that could have been handled a little bit better, but we'll get to that later on. There were also a couple of reports from local residents about a green van parked outside of the cabin at night, and there were also other neighbors who mentioned that they woke up in the middle of the night hearing muffled screams, but they just decided to go back to bed. Didn't really think it was anything. Didn't think about calling the police, which is a bit weird, but can't blame them. We don't know what they thought it was, but that didn't go anywhere. They just left it and went back to bed. And with all of this going on, all of the investigations, everything that they are doing, Tina Sharp is still missing. Nowhere to be found. Nobody knows exactly what happened to her. But they did see that there was blood on her bed. So the investigators were starting to make a few speculations. And they think that maybe Tina was abducted. And that maybe the whole reason for this attack was to get to Tina. So investigators started interviewing people, and the first person was Justin, the neighbor who was staying at the cabin 28, and also one of the survivors. When they interviewed him, he claimed that he had a dream about the murders, which is a little bit weird. But later on in the interview, he confirmed that he was actually awake during the murders and that he actually witnessed it. And a few people think that's a little bit weird and then maybe he was involved in some way, but I just see that as a traumatized young boy who saw or heard something horrible happening and didn't know how to process it or even how to act afterwards. But again, we can't really confirm any of this. At one point, he told the police that he saw who committed the murders. So he gave them a description of the suspects, and he said that the two men that were there were supposedly seen speaking with Sue, and one of them had a mustache and the other one had like a clean shaven beard and had long hair. So Justin also said that when John and Dana returned home from their party, they allegedly began arguing with this man, and the confrontation became violent throughout the night. He also said that Tina had returned home a short time later and was escorted outside by one of the men. Sketches with the descriptions that Justin gave were put out to the public, but this didn't go anywhere. Nobody was able to identify any of the suspects. Also, if you remember earlier, I mentioned that John and Dana hitchhiked back from Quincy after the party. The person who drove them was also interviewed at some point, and it seems like they were cleared by authorities early on. So there's no really connection between the person who drove them to the crime. Not that we know anyways. When Justin returned home after all of this happened, he had blood on his shoes. So his mom gave his shoes to their authorities, but apparently they lost it. So they just lost the evidence. But anyways, that's not surprising in this case because it just gets worse from here. But after this, after seeing that there was blood in his shoes and all of his descriptions, the police 100% believes that Justin was a witness to the murders. So let's talk a little bit about Justin and who his family was. So he lived in cabin 26 and his mom was Marilyn Smart and his dad was Martin Smart. Marilyn have told the officers that her husband was really a violent guy and allegedly he tried to run over her and their son. So very suspicious, very strange behavior. And he also pulled a knife on her in 1980. Again, this is alleged, not We don't have proof of this, but very suspicious. Also reports that Sue was counseling Marilyn on their marriage, so she was probably close with Marilyn as they were neighbors and their kids hanged out. So I'm sure that Marilyn at some stage trusted Sue to talk about her life with Martin, and maybe Sue also at some stage told Marilyn about her marriage and how she dealt with an abusive husband. So they probably connected with that, and Marilyn just wanted to probably get this out of her chest and have someone to talk to. And it's completely understandable to me that if those allegations are true, that he actually tried to run her over and pulled a knife on her, that she would need someone to talk to and probably maybe would want a divorce. Apparently, Martin found out that Sue and Marilyn were talking about their relationship, and he was really not happy about it at all. He was really pissed off. He doesn't seem to be the most calm guy, but yeah, he was not happy that Sue was giving his wife advice about their marriage. So even though this is all very suspicious and they were already starting to consider Martin as a suspect, because it's clear that he might have had a motive to kill Sue because she was counseling his wife about their marriage, law enforcement thought that the killer was not one person because of the nature of the crime scene and everything that they investigated. But Martin had a roommate called John Bowlby. His name is really hard to pronounce, so I'll call him Bo. But he was known to have connections with organized crime in the area, and he would just sleep on Martin's couch for a while. Not sure why, but maybe he had some difficulty with living situations and stuff like that, so Martin was just helping him out. But on the night of the murder, Bo and Martin were actually seen at the town's bar at 10 p.m. And after some time, they left the bar and they came back again later on wearing suits, ties, and sunglasses, which is quite strange behavior. And a lot of people say that they were acting really weird. So it seems to investigators that they were trying to draw attention to themselves, and that's why they were dressed like that, because they wanted to use this as their alibi. So they wanted people to notice that they were at the bar. Martin told the investigators that they left the bar at around 2 a.m., but that was not confirmed. So because they seem a little bit suspicious about Martin, they decide to investigate him and question him. So during the interview, he admits to the police that he was missing a blue-handled claw hammer. So if we remember, in the crime scene, they found one claw hammer, but it was clear that 2 claw hammers were used, so one of them was missing, and he was missing one. So suspicious again. This guy is just 100% suspicious. I don't know why he would say that if he committed a crime, he would not try to cover for himself. I don't know. But he says he's missing the hammer, and actually, many years later, in 2016, a man with a metal detector finds a blue-handled hammer that matches the description from Martin in the pond near the Keddie property, so near cabin 28. So again, many years later, it's really strange, and it's the exact same description. So it would be really hard for it to be just some random other hammer. Too much coincidence. Later on, a witness also stated that they saw Martin Smart burning clothes on the morning of the murder. Like we said, because of the crime scene having blood everywhere, it was very likely that whoever done this had blood all over them. So they had to get rid of their clothes because Clearly, they weren't gonna be walking around town with blood all over them or their clothes, and also they wouldn't throw their blooded clothes in the bin, right? So the best way to get rid of it would be to burn it. So it makes total sense, if this is true, that he was burning his clothes if there was blood on it. But again, this is just alleged, not confirmed. So things are not looking good for Martin. He already seems suspicious enough. But to make things even worse, shortly after the murders, both Smart and Bo moved out of Keddie. Martin moved to Nevada, and there he began seeing a counselor. And the counselor came forward that Martin confessed to killing both Sue and Tina. So he also said that Martin allegedly was planning this as a revenge for Sue for convincing his wife to leave him. So that makes sense according to the information we have. We don't know if this is true or not. And also the Department of Justice dismissed this claim as hearsay, and they just didn't look into it any further, which again, it's very suspicious. So here's where things start getting really strange with the investigation, because it looks like they are not caring when it comes to Martin as a suspect, that they interviewed him, but whenever there's any evidence that comes in that it's directed to him, that this is just overlooked. And you will see a little bit more of that later on. But if you think there's not enough evidence against Martin, he also wrote a very suspicious letter to his wife that wrote, "I've paid the price of your love, and now that I've bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we are through? Great, what else do you want?" So a very strange letter. Like, it looks like a confession. Clearly he says that he bought her love with people's lives. So what is he trying to say? That she asked him to do it, or that was a proof of love? If that's his idea of love, then clearly he really needs help. But it's just a really strange letter. But Marilyn, his wife, her ex-wife, reportedly didn't recall receiving this letter, but later on she did confirm that it looked a lot like her ex-husband's handwriting. But guess what? This was also overlooked and ignored by the original investigators, so they didn't do anything else regarding this letter, which is really, really strange. So that's when a lot of rumors start spreading that somehow law enforcement covered up the truth in this case. And even though this is a theory, we don't know that for sure. It seems like very possible if we take in the facts. During a documentary in 2008, Marilyn said that she suspected Martin and both of being the killers. And however, if that's the case, it's too late to bring them to justice if they committed the murders, because Bo died in 1988 and Martin died in 2000. So right now, what we have is Martin as a suspect, Bo as a suspect, a lot of suspicious behavior from law enforcement, and Tina still missing. And it's only after 3 years of the murders, on April 22nd of 1984, that someone collecting bottles in the woods in Buddy County, that is around like 26 kilometers from Keddie, ends up finding what they thought were human remains. And this area, it's like a really hidden area. It's quite difficult to find. It's a spot that's called Camp 18. So this has led to for some people to speculate that the person who was there hunting bottles was probably tipped off somehow into discovering Tina's remains. And although there's literally zero evidence for this, it's just another theory, but it is entirely possible that someone did tip him off to discover the remains, but we just don't know that for sure because we don't have enough evidence to prove it currently. But the bottle hunter contacted the authorities shortly after discovering the remains, and law enforcement recovered what they could find of the skeleton, and later a medical examiner confirmed that they were from Tina Sharp via dental records. So after the news were out about remains being found and before the skull was identified, there was an anonymous 911 call made claiming that the remains were from Tina, even though there was no medical examination that confirmed it yet. And the caller said, I was
watching the news, and they were talking about this skull they found at the foot of the falls. They asked for any help. And I was just wondering if you thought of the murder up in Keddie, up in Plymouth County a couple years ago, where a 12-year-old girl was
So whoever made this 911 call clearly knew something about the murders or knew someone that knew something about the murders. But unfortunately, again, the police did not investigate this call until many years later, and the call's recording was found again by authorities, and then they started taking another look at the case. But early at that moment when it was found, nobody did anything about it, which again, not surprising in this case, but yes, very frustrating. So with all of this, it looks like the investigation was not done really well, and some people accused the sheriff's office of botching the investigation, and the former sheriff Doug Thomas was accused of a cover-up because allegedly he was very close friends with Martin at the time. So people were thinking that because they were close friends, he was trying to cover up for him, but he did come out a few years ago to address the accusation, and he said that they were never friends, that he only helped him out for a while because Martin was having trouble in his marriage. So him and his wife went to his office to talk and ask for advice, and that's all, and they never had any other connection whatsoever. But I don't know if this is true, nobody knows, but it seems a little bit suspicious that all of the evidence against Martin and everything was overlooked, and also that he managed to leave Keddie throughout this and just move to another place and just like while he's a suspect of a murder. Everything is very weird. But in 2013, the case was finally reopened, and the new sheriff Greg Hagwood reached out to Mike Gainberg, who was at the time a private investigator. And Gainberg was organizing the boxes of the case reports and the evidences that had been shoved aside. And he ended up finding the letter that was written by Marty Smart to his wife, and then also the recording of the 911 call that suggested that the remains were from Tina. And the former sheriff Hagwood at the time said to Plymouth News that they were looking into it again, and they did have some new evidence, and that they identified a few people locally who knew more than what they've said previously. So they were confident that these people either participated on the crime or that they had any sort of first-hand information on it. So with all of this that we have, all of this mishandled evidence, Martin being a suspect, Justin witnessing the crime, but the boys being unharmed, and Tina missing and only being found 3 years later, it's quite a messy case, and there are a lot of theories, just like any other unsolved case. And some of these theories are improbable, but some of them could make sense. So the first evidence, and the one that seems to be the most obvious one, is that Martin and Bo were the killers. There's just too many circumstances and indirect evidences that indicate that they could have been the killers, specifically towards Martin. The letter to his wife confessing the murders, for example, his alleged confession to the counselor, also reporting that his hammer was missing, and then later a hammer matching his exact description being found on a pond near the cabin, allegedly burning his clothes on the morning of the murders, having a motive to kill Sue for interfering in his marriage, leaving Keddie shortly after the murders took place, basically escaping, if you would say, and also allegedly having this sort of like buddy relationship with the sheriff. Even though he denied it, it's still a possibility. And at the time, this meant that he might have been overlooked as a suspect. The second theory is that this could have been a robbery gone wrong. This to me seems quite difficult to believe, because there's no evidence that anything was stolen from cabin 28. So if someone was going to rob, why didn't they take anything? And also, the Sharps were not a well-off family. They were struggling financially. And if someone was going to steal from anywhere in the cabin, why would they steal from them? It just didn't make sense. And also, why would any robbers commit such a violent murder and then also not take anything? It's very, very weird. If they wanted to rob, it could have had some sort of violence, but they wouldn't go through this aggressive murder, and they wouldn't leave without taking at least one item. It just doesn't make sense. The third theory is that the murders were due to drugs. So there is some evidence that both John and Dana were involved in drugs. In an article in Feather River Bulletin that was written in May 1987, it is stated that John Sharp had once broken into a house and stole some marijuana, and that Dana Wingate was also a ward of the court and on probation at the time. There was one witness also that came forward that claiming that allegedly Dana stole some LSD from local drug dealers, but there's no evidence that could be found to back this statement. But with all that being said, a few teenagers dabbling in drugs does not necessarily mean that the murders were committed because of drug involvement. Killing 3 people in such an aggressive way and abducting and murdering another, it just seems like a strange behavior for like a small amount of weed and LSD. It's just a very extreme response. Now, the last theory that we'll be going over is that one of Sue's ex-boyfriends was the killer. So, like we mentioned before, she did have 3 relationships, like short relationships that weren't very serious throughout the time that she lived in Keddie. Also, James, her ex-husband, even though he was abusive, it's just not possible that he would have committed a crime because he lived like on the other side of the country. It is not possible that he would have got there, committed a crime and went back home so quickly. It makes no sense. But Sue's romantic partners at the time were investigated by the authorities, but they were ruled out quite quickly. Even though all of these theories can be correct, they could be possible, it's still really hard to ignore the amount of evidence that points to Martin Smart. It's the most likely theory and the one that makes the most sense. And despite all the evidence and all of this investigation and the case being reopened and them still looking into it to this day, we still the Keddie cabin murders still remains unsolved. After the murders, fearful tourists began avoiding Keddie, and the town soon became some sort of a ghost town. And even though a few people still live there, I'm sure that it's just not the same for them. They must have been completely traumatized and hurt for this incident. And the only people who go there to visit Keddie right now are people who are interested in true crime, or they just have an interest on it, or they just want to seek out Cabin 28 where the murders took place. Thankfully, the cabin was demolished in 2004 because a lot of people were disrespecting the location and they were throwing parties and things like that, which is, come on, right? Really, something really horrible happened here and you're gonna throw parties. It's not okay. So it's a good thing that it was demolished, I guess. Like I said, this year investigators are still looking into the case, and they say that they are closer than ever to cracking it. In the last few years, investigators tested the hammers and the knife for possible DNA evidence, and the FBI examined the anonymous call for the potential voice match. And Gemberg, the investigator, while he was working on the case, he stated that they have several people of interest and they are continuing the investigation. So with that being said, like I said, this is still unsolved. It's quite unfortunate that the investigation was handled quite badly and that the family still has no justice. But if you or anyone you know have any information about the case, please contact the Plumas County Sheriff's Department. I will leave the number on the screen and on the description. And also there is a hotline for the Keddie murders that I'll also leave in the screen and the description. Any information is always helpful to try and bring justice for the family. With that being said, if you have any other questions or any case suggestions, please feel free to leave them in the comment below, and I'll see you on the next episode.